if America participates in splitting the land of Israel, do you know prophetically they're saying that the actual landmass in America will also split? I know. Here's the details. Be sure to subscribe and press alert to get new notifications of new success secrets made available on VFNtv.
We're going to be talking about some exciting things today on our program. One of those things is discipleship making. We have some amazing testimonies that we want to share with you about what God has done in people's lives some time ago, and some of the great contributions they've contributed not only to our nation but to the world. Why? Because they spent time in God's Word, and they found by abiding and growing in the Lord that God's Word spoke to so many areas. And we just have a couple of testimonies, but you don't want to miss it. But before we do, we want to talk about Israel. Right now there are talks potentially of dividing Jerusalem. Now we know that God's spoken prophetically through Brother John Kilpatrick that if the United States gets involved in dividing Jerusalem, we can see a potential divide in America. We don't want to get involved in that. Watch this.
Jerusalem's old city, the Temple Mount, and the Mount of Olives all share common bonds. In addition to biblical significance, they're all in the part of the city Palestinians want as their future capital.
Scripture says Jerusalem is a city set on a hill.
And we are standing on the hill, the Mount of Olives, and we are overlooking the Temple Mount. Beautiful vision here of the old city, and behind it the new city.
Chaim Silberstein, founder and president of Keep Jerusalem, believes the city must remain united. We spent a day looking at Jerusalem from different angles to understand its complexity.
This is a city that's ensconced in geopolitics, in divisiveness, both within the Jewish people and certainly the Arab nations against the Jewish people.
Jerusalem has been conquered more than any other city in history, yet it's been the only capital the Jewish people have ever known. Still, the world refuses to recognize it as Israel's capital, even though it's mentioned more than 640 times in the Old Testament and not once by name in the Quran.
Jerusalem is the capital of Israel.
We know that over 3,000 years ago, King David came here, he conquered Jerusalem, and he set up his capital here. And for 1,000 years, Israel had sovereignty, the Jews had sovereignty in the land of Israel. A pocket of Jews remained in Palestine, in Israel, throughout the centuries. But we only saw a real return of the Jewish people in the last 150 years or so. And today, when we look at Jerusalem, we see Jerusalem built up.
At what point was it that the Arabs, the Palestinians, made a determination that this was their capital?
It was only when the Israelis liberated Jerusalem in '67 that they changed that, because they needed to get us out. So they then created this idea that they want a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital.
On the world stage, Jerusalem is typically divided between East and West. The newer Western city is primarily Jewish. The older eastern section stretches from north to south. The majority of the city's Arabs live there, but so do an almost equal number of Jewish Israelis.
With the city as it is now and the talk of dividing Jerusalem, is that realistic, a divided Jerusalem?
I think that it would be a disaster of historic proportions and a huge mistake, because dividing up Jerusalem will create the exact opposite effect of peace.
From 1949 to 1967, Jerusalem was divided, with Jordan controlling the eastern sector. During 1967 Six-Day War, Israel took back control. Silberstein took me to the battlefield that turned the tide.
This is the actual spot where hand-to-hand combat took place here, is that correct?
Correct. This is probably the toughest battle in Jerusalem during the Six-Day War. Between the west and Mount Scopus was Ammunition Hill, so it was critical to take this hill.
The Bible calls Jerusalem the city of the great king, and it's seen many kings. In 1964, Jordan's King Hussein started building a hilltop palace on the northern edge of Jerusalem. The Six-Day War interrupted his plans.
This site where we are now is not really the palace of King Hussein, but rather the palace of King Saul.
From on high, it's easy to see why kings old and new would want to occupy this hill.
We're looking eastwards, and we're actually looking into the Judean desert. Behind the Judean desert are the mountains of Moab, which is where Jordan is today.
Oh,
So we can see all the way to the Dead Sea and the Jordan Valley. What we see below us is the Jewish neighborhood of Pisgat Ze'ev, and to the north of that, Neve Yaakov. These two neighborhoods are basically nestled within Arab neighborhoods that are surrounding them. If we would cut off Jerusalem and say everything to the left of this line would be Palestine, 90,000 Jews living in these two neighborhoods would find themselves in Palestine.
how can you divide them when they're so integrated?
That is a rhetorical question.
It is.
Yes.
Looking to the north, we could see biblical Judea and Samaria, otherwise known as the West Bank. In the distance, just 5 miles from Jerusalem, is Ramallah, the current seat of government for the Palestinian Authority.
An important thing to understand when you want to understand the strategic issues facing Jerusalem is what is the goal of the Arabs? They understand that Jerusalem is the heart of the Jewish people, and if they can liberate Jerusalem from their point of view, then they will have succeeded in liberating Israel ultimately.
Silverstein believes the Arabs have three main ways they're working to liberate Jerusalem: by force, propaganda and diplomacy, and demography.
What they're doing is building and building and building inside Jerusalem, largely illegal structures, in fact have successfully created a territorial continuum that runs from Ramallah in the north, all the way through Jerusalem, through the Old City, to Bethlehem in the south. And by doing that, they will have infiltrated a demographic Trojan horse inside Jerusalem.
Do you have hope for this city to eventually be whole? Do you see a good future ahead or no?
Zechariah chapter 14 talks about what's happening here on the Mount of Olives. There'll be an earthquake here, there'll be a war, there'll be all kinds of unnatural things that are happening here.
That's yet to happen.
That's yet to happen in the future. But Zechariah ends the prophecy by saying, and Jerusalem will dwell secure. The question is how we will get there. The thing that is guaranteed to bring peace to Jerusalem is keeping Jerusalem united under Israeli sovereignty. And that certainly is the prelude to hopefully the incredible event that we hope and pray will happen later, which will be ultimate peace both to Jerusalem and the world.
Jerusalem should never, ever be divided. Never, and never for the cause of peace. Israel has done this before. They've given up territory. They've given up land for peace, and it never has worked out. And particularly when they gave up the Gaza Strip. Hamas took over, and they've launched over 10,000 rockets into Israel when they gave them the territory and said it was for peace. Listen, we got to be careful because right now in the United Nations, there's already talk of this two-state solution, and you're noticing the propaganda, this BDS movement, boycott, divest, and sanction movement that's being waged against Israel. And there's this strategy, multiple pronged, if you will, to get Israel to release control of Jerusalem. It cannot happen. It will threaten Israel's safety. And if we're involved, if the United States is involved in pressuring Israel at all into giving up this territory, the prophetic word is that God will divide America. When we get back from this break, I want you to hear this prophetic word shared on the Jim Baker Show when Brother Kilpatrick shares this dream, this prophetic vision that God gave him regarding the new Madrid Fault. You don't want to miss it. Join us when we get right back from this break. You know, before the break, we're talking about Jerusalem. We're talking about this silly notion of dividing Jerusalem. It's not going to happen. And if it does happen, it can happen. But if there's an attempt for that to happen, listen, we're going to pay.
Yeah.
We don't want our hands to be involved in that at all. And I want you to listen to Brother John Kilpatrick as he shares this prophetic dream. This is one of our connected dots moments where Greg and I talk about this very thing. And you're going to hear him share in detail what the Lord showed him and the ramifications that will come upon the United States and how this would impact us if we have any part in playing of the dividing of Jerusalem. Watch this.
Imagine the Mississippi River becoming so wide that you couldn't even see either side of the banks, and it was water all but in between. Imagine America just being split. Well, this is what the Lord laid on Pastor John Kilpatrick's heart. If we participate, and look, we're all over it. America is all over trying to split United Nations. And we talked about the unstoppable voting bloc, that the majority of the people inside the United Nations does not like Israel, wants to do away with Israel. Everything is against Israel, and they're going to vote to remove Israel from Jerusalem. So that's a guaranteed thing if it gets turned over to the United Nations, like the president said.
And that's what they're pushing for.
That's what they're pushing for.
That's the agenda.
And a lot of people don't understand that. So they're thinking, oh, the United Nations, he's wanting to carry it to the United Nations. He knows the United Nations is going to vote against Israel. And that's been the platform all along. This has been in our face. This is before us and God. This has nothing to do with man. The question is, will we stand for God? Will we stand for Israel? Will we say, do not? And remember, this is a representative government. So the people in Washington, D.C. vote ever how you tell them to vote. So you're going to have to call them up and let them know, vote for Israel. Do not, allow this thing in this treaty with this nuclear agreement with Iran, who's an enemy of Israel, an enemy of America, and an enemy of God, whose son is Jesus Christ. I mean, this is a major thing. So watch what Pastor John Kilpatrick says is going to happen if this happens to Jerusalem.
Madrid Fault line, you had such a vision that it just shook your life.
It was a dream. I'm having dreams and visions, so that means I'm not quite as old as
You're middle-aged. That means you're middle-aged in Jerusalem.
Jerusalem's the issue.
And that the New Madrid, you saw it shaking. Could you just explain that quickly?
I was suspended over a river down by my house in Alabama. I was hanging over it, looking down at it, and I knew where I was. I could see the river. But immediately that river just went like that out of sight, and you couldn't see the bank of the river at all. And then the scene changed, and I was taken to like an old ancient schoolhouse. I didn't know where it was, and I was running through this old schoolhouse, and my teeth were clapping so hard in the dream I couldn't clamp my teeth tight enough to keep them from clapping because the earth was quaking and bucking like a horse. And I saw a man in my church in front of me, and it was throwing him around like a rag doll. So I said to myself, it must be doing the same to me because I can't keep from my teeth cracking and popping. So then the way it ended up is I saw like an old map of antiquities, and it showed the name Indianola, and it showed Europa. Well, as soon as it was over, I called my wife in, and I said, Brenda, I was shaking so hard, I couldn't stop shaking. It was like I'd seen a tragedy in real life. I just couldn't stop shaking. So she held me for about 30 minutes, and I calmed down. So when we looked up Indianola and we looked up Europa, we found out that there was 5 Indianolas at one time in America, but only 3 left now. One was in Mississippi, one was in Texas, and one was in Illinois. But I saw, whenever that was over, I saw a line going like this way toward Europa. So I knew that it was going from the east to the west. So when Europa was in Missouri and Indianola was in Illinois. Europa is just a small place in Missouri. And Indianola is just a very small place in Illinois. Nothing noteworthy about it at all, and I couldn't figure the dream out. So a pastor called me later that day, and I told him my dream. And he got on the computer, and when he put Indianola in Europa, it was the New Madrid Fault. You could superimpose those 2 cities over the New Madrid Fault. So then it made sense to me that the Lord was showing me that New Madrid Fault was about to break. And listen, that room was bucking so hard. It was bucking exactly like you were on a wild horse, and you couldn't. My teeth wouldn't stop clapping. It was bucking that hard. And I said to myself in the dream, whatever structures were, they are no more. Oh, so I have believed that New Madrid is in the center of our country. And the Great Lakes are up top and the Gulf is at the bottom. What I believe I saw when that river went out of sight is I believe that the Great Lakes was busted loose and the water started draining down. And I believe the Gulf water started draining up. And that's why the waters went out of sight all of a sudden. I think it split America right in half. So what I felt in my spirit, and I can't prove this, I just felt it in my spirit. I felt like the Lord was saying to me, if they divide Jerusalem, if America has a hand in causing, if the Secretary of State or the President or whoever has a hand in causing Israel to divide Jerusalem and giving up that land for peace, I will divide America. And I believe that to this day. I can't prove that, but I believe that to this day. But I will say this. And you can mark this down as a prophetic word. In the days to come, you're going to see earthquakes that will startle you.
Yes.
Because as sin increases, the land will manifest greater than it ever has.
And this New Madrid, I'm sure you've studied it since, the vision. I had no idea these two cities of the same name. And you know, when you looked on that map, it had to shock you that, you know, and that, what was the year it shook before?
When the Mississippi ran
yeah.
backward,
It was the largest earthquake probably in the history of America in the past.
It rang church bells in Boston.
Right.
That's how powerful it was. And that shook, and that river ran backwards. And if it happens now, that was not in modern times. You know, it was in early America. And so if that thing happens now, millions could die. You feel like maybe even all the bridges would go, and literally it would divide America for a period of time, and you couldn't even get across.
The train rails would be disrupted. Trains couldn't run. Trucks would not be able to connect because the earth would split. The waters would come down. So basically, America would be split in half, just like they would be splitting Jerusalem in half. But Jim, in the last days, the Bible never said that Israel would be the issue. The Bible said in the last days, Jerusalem would be the issue.
It's all about Jerusalem. Listen, cut in half. Can you imagine the implications of what that would be like? You can't, you know, no goods, no services are being able to cross because the waters are just all over the place.
You know, to me, it's just indescribable and even unimaginable. It just makes me think that in one of the previous interviews, the guy had said that when he asked if something like this were to happen, what his thoughts were, and he said it would be a disaster of historic proportions. It couldn't be described any other way.
And no doubt.
Be sure to subscribe and press alert to get new notifications of new success secrets made available on VFNtv.
You know, a lot of people want to abide with the Lord, but they just don't have a plan to do it. You can request that plan today at iabide.org. I'm your host, Greg Lancaster, and we're so glad that you've joined us. Don't forget you can join us 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Download our app and sign up for our newsletter, The Torch, at VFNtv.com. I've enjoyed our time together. God bless.